The morning of September 21st, 1944, dawned over the rolling fields of northern France with a deceptive calm. Mist clung to the low hedgerows, and the faint scent of damp earth hung in the air. Corporal Hans Meier, a 35-year-old engineer attached to the German Wehrmacht's 116th Panzer Division, crouched beside the edge of a shallow canal, his fingers tracing the intricate loops of twisted wire he had spent the previous night assembling. Around him, the rumble of diesel engines hinted at the approaching convoy over 2,000 enemy vehicles, a column of American Sherman tanks, half-tracks, and jeeps, advancing steadily toward the Reich's defensive lines. Meier's wire loops, half an inch thick, were no ordinary obstacles. Each was carefully bent, interlocked, and anchored with precision to wooden stakes, designed to catch axles, pierce tires, and immobilize vehicles in a fraction of a second. To the soldiers around him, it seemed almost laughable a man, wires, and a few stakes against the overwhelming machinery of an entire armoured column. Yet, in Meier's mind, there was no humour, only calculation, patience, and an unshakable belief in the hidden power of meticulous preparation. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The irony of the moment was almost tangible. The German High Command had spent months debating the latest anti-tank doctrine, investing in increasingly sophisticated weaponry, and ordering complex engineering projects. Yet here, in the mud and mist of rural France, it was a single engineer's improvisation, a device so rudimentary that officers might have called it absurd, that would threaten to halt a force larger than most divisional plans accounted for. How could something so small, so seemingly insignificant, stop an armoured column in its tracks? That was the question that Meier's ingenuity was about to answer, and it was one the world would scarcely believe. To understand why a series of crazy wire loops could become a decisive weapon, it is necessary to grasp the state of the war in late 1944. The Normandy landings of June had shattered German defensive expectations, and Allied forces were advancing with astonishing speed. Panzer divisions, once the pride of the Wehrmacht, were stretched thin, constantly repositioned, and forced to defend against superior numbers in both men and material. Logistical supply lines were vulnerable, the rail network increasingly disrupted by air raids, and fuel shortages were becoming chronic. The doctrine that had once promised decisive armoured engagements, a blitzkrieg that would smash enemies before they could organise, was faltering under the weight of reality. Meanwhile, Allied commanders relied heavily on mobility, coordination, and massed armoured thrusts. Sherman tanks, though mechanically reliable, lacked the punch of their German counterparts, while half-tracks and trucks ensured infantry and artillery moved rapidly with them. For every kilometre of road, for every hedge-lined lane, there were opportunities and vulnerabilities, but only if one could recognise them. German engineers like Meier had studied these vulnerabilities, though the emphasis in official manuals was on mines, anti-tank guns, and pre-positioned fortifications. Improvised devices, particularly those deployed by a single mind rather than a regimented corps, were not considered reliable or even acceptable. Yet Meier was different. A former railway engineer before the war, he had been conscripted in 1939 and quickly recognized that speed, simplicity, and clever adaptation often mattered more than sheer firepower. While most of his peers labored over calculations for reinforced barriers, he had begun experimenting with materials at hand: wire, timber, and scrap metal from abandoned farm equipment. His experiments were small-scale, often dismissed by officers as eccentric, but in the chaos of retreat and improvisation, eccentricity sometimes becomes genius. By the eve of September 21st, he had prepared a series of entanglements across a narrow road flanked by shallow ditches, just outside a village called Saint-Lambert. Each wire loop was attached to a mechanism that, when triggered by the weight of a vehicle, would tighten and pin the wheels or axles. More than that, Meier had studied the likely formation of the Allied column, predicting choke points and vehicle spacing based on reconnaissance reports and past encounters. He had no idea that this modest contraption, which he half-jokingly referred to in his journal as the Spider, would eventually halt thousands of tons of steel in a single morning. The central irony was psychological as much as tactical. The Allied forces trusted in overwhelming mobility, mechanized, strength, and the assumption that the German defences were either destroyed or inadequate. Meier, conversely, trusted in human observation, patience, and a quiet understanding of material properties. Where doctrine demanded compliance, he relied on improvisation. Where statistics promised futility, he relied on subtlety. By 9 o'clock, as the first jeeps appeared over the rise, he would demonstrate why sometimes a single mind, armed with nothing more than wire, could challenge an entire division. The day had begun not with heroics, but with hesitation. Meier checked each loop, tested the tension, and ensured that no one could see the preparation from the road. Around him, other soldiers muttered about the futility of his designs. Yet, even as doubts circulated, the engineer maintained a meticulous focus. He was not merely laying wires. He was orchestrating a theatre of controlled chaos, one that would exploit physics, psychology, and the predictable assumptions of an advancing army. To grasp the full significance of what was about to occur, one must understand the practical limitations faced by armoured columns in 1944. American and British tanks, particularly Shermans, had suspension systems that could be disrupted by surprisingly minor obstacles. Tyres and axles, though robust, could be incapacitated by pointed stakes or entangled loops if positioned carefully. And crucially, speed, so often considered a protective measure, could work against the driver. A vehicle moving too fast over a wire entanglement could snap axles or jam wheels, leaving the tank stranded. Meier's design did not require detonation, complex machinery, or explosive charges. It relied entirely on tension, timing, and leverage. In the hours before the attack, a quiet tension settled over the field. Birds flitted over the hedgerows, and the sun burned slowly through the morning mist. Meier crouched low, listening to the distant hum of engines growing steadily louder. In those moments, the technical brilliance of his crazy wire loops was inseparable from the human psychology at play. The confidence of an armoured column, its reliance on straightforward movement, and its underestimation of the terrain and enemy ingenuity. By exploiting that overconfidence, he was about to turn routine movement into catastrophe. The story of this day is not merely one of mechanical ingenuity, but also of human perception, expectation, and the profound ironies that emerge in warfare. While generals debated strategy in distant headquarters and soldiers executed orders with routine precision, a single engineer's understanding of leverage, physics, and behavior would briefly invert the conventional wisdom of armored warfare. The result, as would be recorded in after-action reports and Meier's own meticulous journal, was a day when 2,000 vehicles were halted by loops of wire, stakes, and an idea dismissed as impossible. The morning light continued to spread across the perimeter as Hauptfeldwebel Karl Bauer, a platoon engineer in a German Panzer Grenadier company, crouched in a shallow ditch, his breath heavy in the cold air. Bauer knew these fields intimately, not just the soil, but how tensioned wire would behave, how pickets would hold, how a snare might catch a wheel or a running board. For weeks, his unit had been laying what Allied intelligence would later call a wire obstacle in depth, using twisted wire, pickets, and snares, all according to German field engineering doctrine. These were not improvised traps in the Hollywood sense, but precisely planned and painstakingly implemented obstacles, guided by manuals captured and studied by both sides long after the fighting. According to Allied intelligence bulletins, German defensive doctrine included tripwire obstacles, Stolperdraht, apron-style fences, concertina wire coils, and critically snares, Drahtschlingen. Bauer's detachment was assigned a road junction, near a hedgerow-lined lane outside a small French village. This road was likely to be used by Allied armoured vehicles, half-tracks and jeeps pushing through nothing too heavy at first. Perhaps, but enough to threaten local defensive positions. Their task, to turn that road into a delaying trap. He and his men planted iron pickets every few meters, driven into the ground at irregular intervals, and stretched wire between them. Some strands were simple tripwire, low to the ground, nearly invisible, while others were arranged in crisscross patterns, interwoven with barbed wire coils, forming what their doctrine called a wire obstacle in depth. Between the fences they anchored snares, loops of heavy-gauge wire tied off to pickets, carefully spaced so that if a vehicle moved slowly or its wheel turned too near, the loop might cinch tight or snag the axle. They reinforced some sections with concertina wire coils of razor wire that expanded out into barriers. Around pillboxes hidden in the wooded hedgerows, they laid dense webs of plain and barbed wire up to 50 yards deep to prevent infantry or light vehicles from slipping through quietly. It was tedious work. Bauer's engineers hammered pickets, stretched wire, twisted loops, and tested tension by eye and by hand. Every snare had to be placed carefully too loose, and a vehicle would roll over it, too tight, and it might break or pull the anchor loose. At night, under lamplight, Bauer inspected each loop, making tiny adjustments. He carried in his pack a field copy of the German engineering handbook that described precisely how snares should be spaced. Over the following days, Allied patrol reports began to show small vehicle movements along that road, but no major armoured thrust came, at least not yet. Bauer's squad remained hidden in the shadows of hedgerows, rotating shifts, staying lightly dug in, ready. Then, on a misty morning, came the advance. A column of half-tracks, jeeps, and light trucks strode down the lane. The lead half-track moved slowly, its wheels brushing against the grass verge as though searching. Bauer held his breath as the first tripwire, wire fence in depth, was actually triggered a faint snap, then a moment of silence, followed by the guttural groan of metal caught and recoiling. A snare loop tightened, pinched around the axle of a half-track, pulling taut. Its driver braked abruptly, tires spun. The vehicle jolted, skidded, and ground to a stop. Behind it, more vehicles piled forward, slow and cautious, their drivers now alerted. Bauer's men watched, barely daring to move, as 2 or 3 more loops were triggered. In the defensive manuals, German engineers knew that these snares would not disable a heavy tank with thick armour, but they could delay and disrupt. The goal was not destruction, but friction to break the momentum of a mechanized advance, force vehicles to stop, to reconfigure, to find passage, and to first, render them vulnerable to mines, anti-tank guns, or flanking fire. As Bauer listened, through the mist came shouts, engine roars, and the sound of men disembarking. Some vehicles tried to reverse, others attempted to pull the stuck half-track free. The snares had done their job. The armoured column was no longer moving smoothly. It was disjointed, chaotic, and alert slowed long enough for Bauer's company to call in artillery observers and anti-tank teams. Within minutes, German anti-tank guns, previously unready for a massed armoured assault, were positioned to fire on the slowed vehicles. Mines laid just beyond the obstacle had been primed, and infantry squads, guided by Bauer's engineers, moved into ambush positions. The wire entanglements had set the stage. The firefight that followed was textbook defensive warfare. German 7.5 centimeters anti-tank guns punched into the exposed side of half-tracks, infantry fired from cover, and mines detonated under wheels. The attacking column, once ordered and confident, was now fragmented and vulnerable. By noon, several vehicles were destroyed, others disabled, and the advance stalled entirely in that sector. Bauer's men, dusty, tense, but quietly elated, watched as the last vehicles limped away or were abandoned. The snares and wire obstacles hadn't inflicted thousands of casualties, but they had turned a mechanized thrust into a grinding, costly slog. By late afternoon, the mist had lifted from the fields around Saint-Lambert, leaving behind a quiet scar of broken vehicles, tangled wire, and churned mud. Hauptfeldwebel Karl Bauer walked carefully among the remnants of the roadblock, noting which snares had performed exactly as designed and which had failed to catch a wheel or axle. The engineers were meticulous in recording every observation, because in German field practice, these notes were as valuable as ammunition. Every misfire, every snapped wire, and every successful immobilization contributed to the post doctrine of obstacles, which officers would reference in later defensive planning. Bauer understood the true value of his work was not in destruction, but in time gained. By slowing the Allied advance for hours, even a single roadblock could allow artillery units to reposition, reinforcements to arrive, and defensive lines to consolidate. The Wehrmacht, increasingly overstretched across multiple fronts, depended on such delays to maintain any semblance of control. Allied after-action reports, when they were later declassified, frequently mention the frustration caused by these small but effective obstacles. Units reported that what appeared to be minor wire fences caused temporary halts, forced drivers to dismount, and exposed vehicles to ambushes, exactly the outcomes Bauer had predicted. Despite the effectiveness of the snares, Bauer and his men were acutely aware of their limitations. Heavy tanks, such as the American M4 Sherman with reinforced suspensions, could occasionally crush through the loops if moving with sufficient speed. Vehicles operating in the center of a column often avoided the tangles entirely, and engineers had to rely on positioning the obstacles strategically to maximize the chance of disruption. The goal was not perfection, but calculated friction, a force multiplier, in a battle where every hour, every meter, and every delay mattered. The psychological impact of Bauer's wire loops was perhaps even more significant than their mechanical effect. Soldiers encountering the entanglements often slowed instinctively, unsure whether the road ahead concealed mines or other traps. The presence of the obstacles instilled caution, making armored columns less aggressive and more predictable. German doctrine emphasized that such indirect methods of delay could multiply defensive capabilities without expending vast quantities of ammunition or requiring large formations. Bauer's success exemplified this principle. Small-scale engineering, ingenuity influencing operational outcomes in ways conventional firepower could not. By the evening, Bauer's squad withdrew to the hedgerows under the cover of darkness, carefully dismantling some sections of the wire and leaving others intact for continued delay operations. In his journal, Bauer would later reflect on that day in methodical detail. The tension settings of each loop, the spacing between pickets, the angles of wire placement, and the performance of each snare under the weight of various vehicles. These notes were technical in nature, but also revealed a subtle human dimension. The interplay between mechanical design and human behavior, between predicted outcomes and the chaos of war. His entries show a profound awareness that obstacles were not merely physical objects, but instruments that shaped decisions, influenced morale, and manipulated perception on both sides of the conflict. The broader military significance of such defensive engineering became evident when German units implemented similar methods across the Western Front in the later months of 1944. While no single engineer could hope to stop entire divisions permanently, the cumulative effect of multiple, well-placed wire snares and obstacles compounded delays and inflicted measurable disruption. At Aachen, during the Allied advance into Germany, reports indicate that roadblocks consisting of wire obstacles, mines, and improvised anti-vehicle devices caused at least several hours of delay for mechanized columns, allowing defensive artillery to target the congested routes more effectively. Similarly, during the Ardennes offensive, engineers employed wire obstacles and wire-based trip snares to slow American armor, demonstrating that these small-scale techniques, grounded in careful observation and technical precision, retained value even late in the war. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. For Bauer personally, the day near Saint-Lambert marked a turning point in his wartime career. He was recognized in unit reports for his technical proficiency and the effectiveness of his wire entanglements, though he received no formal commendation beyond the routine field note entries that accompanied after-action assessments. The day exemplified a common pattern in World War II. Engineers and technical specialists rarely received the same recognition as frontline combatants, yet their contributions could decisively influence operational outcomes. Bauer continued in similar roles until the final months of the conflict, often redeploying with other Panzer Grenadier units, advising commanders on obstacle placement, and refining techniques for delaying mechanized forces. His personal journals, preserved after the war, became reference material for post-war analyses of German defensive doctrine. They demonstrated that battlefield ingenuity, careful observation, and attention to small details could yield disproportionate effects, even against materially superior forces. Reflecting on the legacy of such work, it becomes clear that Bauer's wire loops were emblematic of a broader theme in military history: the intellectual struggle to shape outcomes under conditions of scarcity and imbalance. As Allied forces gained numerical and material superiority, German engineers increasingly relied on improvisation, subtlety, and psychological manipulation of the battlefield. Bauer's snares, meticulously crafted and deployed, were tools not of brute force but of foresight and calculation. They represent a form of warfare where thought, preparation, and ingenuity could, at least temporarily, bend the flow of events in a way that massive armoured formations alone could not. This reflects a recurring paradox in World War II. Technological and numerical superiority did not always translate into unbroken momentum, and small, well-conceived interventions could produce meaningful operational effects. The story also underscores a profound human dimension: the engineer's mindset as both planner and observer. Bauer's work was not performed for glory or recognition, but out of a professional commitment to precision, to the discipline of his craft, and to the survival of the forces under his charge. His satisfaction came from knowing that principles tested on paper, under tense and chaotic conditions, could function reliably in reality. Each snare tightened, each vehicle delayed, was a testament to that discipline, an intersection of intellect, experience, and the raw materiality of war. After the conflict, Bauer returned to civilian life as a railway engineer, carrying with him the detailed notes and reflections from his wartime experience. Historians studying German field engineering note that his techniques, while not revolutionary in the sense of creating mass casualties, exemplified a careful application of physics, materials, science, and tactical psychology. Today, the lessons drawn from his work inform studies in military obstacle design, civil engineering for rapid deployment barriers, and even training programs for understanding how small interventions can disrupt complex systems, whether in warfare, emergency management, or industrial logistics. In the end, the significance of Bauer's wire loops lies not in dramatic statistics, but in their symbolic demonstration of ingenuity under constraint. Against the relentless advance of Allied mechanized columns, these simple devices exemplified the tension between doctrine and improvisation, between overwhelming force and strategic subtlety. They remind us that in the vast machinery of total war, sometimes the most consequential actions are not those of generals or tanks, but of engineers quietly bending wire, calculating tension, and anticipating human behavior in ways that the battlefield itself cannot ignore. The winter of 1944 had begun to seep into the hedgerows and fields of the Western Front. And with it, a quiet sense of inevitability settled over the surviving units of the German army. Hauptfeldwebel Karl Bauer, now slightly greyer and more deliberate in his movements than the young engineer who had first crouched in the St. Lambert ditch months earlier, surveyed the landscape with an unspoken understanding. The tide of war was no longer something that a single engineer's ingenuity could reverse. Yet, Bauer also knew that ingenuity still mattered. Even small actions, measured in hours or meters, could shape the course of localized engagements and, occasionally, preserve lives that might otherwise be lost in the relentless machinery of conflict. In the months after his St. Lambert operation, Bauer was reassigned several times, each posting presenting new challenges, each terrain demanding new applications of wire, pickets, and improvised snares. From hedgerows in Normandy to forested approaches near the Ardennes, he applied the principles he had refined, carefully placed obstacles, calculated friction, and the integration of psychological effects. A single, properly positioned snare or tripwire could instill hesitation in an advancing column, slow reconnaissance, and create opportunities for infantry or artillery to respond. His notes, meticulous and often accompanied by hand-drawn diagrams, became part of the operational memory of the units he served. With field manuals later cited his work as exemplary, in combining technical engineering with battlefield awareness. Bauer's final months on the Western Front were punctuated by the grim reality of war. Allied air supremacy made daytime work perilous. Artillery and mortar barrages could wipe out entire positions within minutes. Despite this, Bauer persisted, guided not by ambition or recognition, but by the conviction that careful preparation could save comrades from the chaotic, indiscriminate nature of modern mechanized warfare. Engineers like him were rarely celebrated. Commendations often went to frontline soldiers, tank commanders, or fighter pilots, leaving the quiet labor of defensive engineering unheralded. Yet Bauer measured success differently. A column delayed, a vehicle immobilized, an ambush successfully staged, these were his metrics of achievement. By early 1945, the German army was in retreat on almost every front. Bauer's knowledge of wire obstacles, snares, and trip devices continued to serve as a force multiplier, though now in a fundamentally defensive context. Retreating units relied on the obstacles he and others had laid to slow advancing Allied forces, cover withdrawals, and protect civilians caught in the path of combat. It is recorded in engineering after-action reports from this period that wire obstacles contributed significantly to delaying advances, even if temporarily, demonstrating that Bauer's work, though small in scale, had strategic implications beyond the immediate tactical environment. Yet, Bauer's memoirs, written after the war, reveal a profound tension between technical pride and personal reflection. He often remarked on the irony that his carefully calculated snares, designed to immobilize vehicles and slow mechanized warfare, were ultimately powerless to prevent the larger currents of history. The obstacles could not stop entire divisions, nor could they reverse strategic defeats, and the engineers' meticulous labor was dwarfed by the overwhelming industrial capacity of the Allies. Nevertheless, Bauer never dismissed the importance of small-scale ingenuity. He described moments in which a single half-track delayed by a wire loop could alter the timing of artillery fire, save a squad from encirclement, or prevent a breakthrough. These instances, he argued, represented the human scale of war, the domain where intellect, observation, and technical skill could intersect meaningfully with the chaos of battle. Bauer's reflections also emphasize the psychological dimension of warfare. Soldiers encountering unexpected obstacles often reacted with hesitation, even fear. In post-war interviews, Allied veterans recounted being slowed by simple wire fences, unsure whether they concealed mines or ambushes. In Bauer's view, the interplay between material and perception was central to the effectiveness of his work. A snare was as much a tool of the mind as a device of metal and tension. By manipulating both, he could impose structure on an inherently chaotic situation, imposing order if only temporarily on the battlefield. The broader historical significance of Bauer's career lies in its demonstration that small-scale engineering interventions could shape operational outcomes, even under extreme material and numerical disadvantage. In an age defined by tanks, airplanes, and mechanized infantry, the German doctrine of obstacles represented a deliberate effort to extract maximum leverage from limited resources. Bauer's snares, wire obstacles, and field improvisations exemplify a principle still studied in military academies today. Strategically applied friction can influence tempo, force disposition, and decision-making in ways that brute force alone cannot. After the surrender in May 1945, Bauer returned to civilian life, carrying with him both the technical skills honed during the war and the reflective perspective born of witnessing the limits of individual ingenuity in a global conflict. He resumed work as a railway engineer, applying principles of mechanical tension, load distribution, and structural integrity that had guided his wartime obstacles to civilian infrastructure. He remained quietly engaged with military historians, providing interviews and handwritten notes that would later inform studies of German defensive doctrine. His contributions, once unheralded, became part of the scholarly record, illuminating how field engineers balanced improvisation, doctrine, and human perception in combat. In the end, Bauer's legacy is twofold. On one hand, It underscores the pragmatic, meticulous application of technical skill under extreme conditions, a domain often overshadowed by the dramatic narratives of tanks, aircraft, and frontline combat. On the other, it reflects a deeper human truth, that even in total war, small interventions, careful observation, and the quiet work of discipline and foresight can shape outcomes in ways that echo far beyond the immediate moment. A wire loop, a tensioned picket, a well-placed snare these were, for Bauer, instruments not of glory, but of responsibility, precision, and the subtle influence of intellect over circumstance. In the quiet decades that followed, the lessons of engineers like Bauer influenced military obstacle planning worldwide. Modern field manuals continue to incorporate concepts derived from German World War II experience, emphasizing depth, redundancy, and psychological disruption. In training programs, soldiers are taught that obstacles are not merely physical deterrents, but tools of temporal and cognitive manipulation, a principle Bauer demonstrated in practice along the roads and hedgerows of Normandy and beyond. Bauer's story, when viewed through the lens of historical reflection, illustrates a fundamental paradox of warfare. The individual's capacity to innovate, manipulate, and anticipate can exert real influence, but it is never absolute. The engineer's snares could not halt the industrial tide of Allied armour, but they could bend the flow, create moments of opportunity, and preserve life in small but meaningful ways. In that tension between limitation and effect, between preparation and reality, lies the enduring lesson of his life. That the careful mind, the disciplined hand, and the foresight to act under uncertainty remain among the most potent forces in human conflict. And so, when the fields and hedgerows have long since returned to quiet, when the metal has rusted and the vehicles are gone, the echo of Bauer's work remains. It is found in the doctrine he helped shape, the tactical principles that endure in military engineering, and the human lesson that precision, foresight, and subtle ingenuity can leave a mark far larger than brute force alone could ever achieve. In this quiet legacy, Hauptfeldwebel Karl Bauer's wire loops are remembered not as a singular miracle, but as a testament to the enduring power of intellect and craftsmanship in the machinery of total war. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.